This fall, when I was on leave and had some time on my hands, I watched the beginning of this season's The Voice, one I knew to be a popular television show. If you haven't seen it, it is a reality singing competition that begins with the premise that the music industry should be about the quality of music rather than the show. The Voice begins its competition with blind auditions as the 4 judges are shielded in these huge, humongous chairs from seeing anything about the performer, and they can only hear their voice and the music. Those judges then decide who will be on their team based solely on the quality of the music that the performer makes. All other cues have been removed. Of course, as Hollywood always does, in the end, they do make it about more than the music, as you see lots of bantering back and forth between the judges. But the beginning of the season always begins with the music being front and center. Today, we meet John, who in other Gospels is known as the Baptist, but who is not in this Gospel. He is known as the Voice. Interesting that the show is the same name. We catch him in the middle of the conversation where others are trying to find out just who he is. As we eavesdrop, we see a man who doesn't recount what makes him great, but who says who he is not. We meet John, who insists that he is the voice who points to Jesus Christ. Now, don't let John's humility in saying who he is not make you think that John doesn't know who he is. He does. He knows exactly who he is and what he is about. He is not timid in that knowledge and declares boldly that he only comes to point to the one, the great I am, who takes away the alienation that we feel from God and from our neighbors. John shares the good news that we are not alone and that God reconciles us to God's own self and to each other. John is a witness to the work of God in the world. As Debbie Thomas says, John chooses total humility and is a witness speaking on behalf of someone other than himself. On this 3rd Sunday of Advent, John reminds us that our role in preparing for Christ is to show others the way, to be the voice testifying to where God is in the world, to be the voice speaking, showing others who Christ is. It is a refreshing change from a world where self-promotion and self-aggrandizement seem to be the norm rather than the exception. And I can't help but wonder if we like to point out that narcissism in others because it's more difficult to point it out and admit it in ourselves. I wonder if in the church we have forgotten our role of pointing to Jesus and begun to point at us. When we've worried more about our discomfort in worship than about pointing to the love of Christ, when we're concerned about how the church isn't like it once was, more than we are intent in pointing to God's love in the world, I wonder if we've forgotten that loving God and loving our neighbor isn't about our rights, but about our shared common humanity with our neighbor. John stands as one in the wilderness, crying out, calling out, asking us to see the one who so loved the world that he gave himself up for us and for the whole world. Just who are we giving witness to? We are testifying to the God of whom Isaiah says brings good news to the oppressed, binds up the brokenhearted, proclaims liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, proclaims the year of the Lord's favor, comforts all who mourns, and provides for those who mourn so that they will have a garland instead of ashes and the oil of gladness instead of mourning. And it is seen in our world in very tangible ways. We are giving witness to Christ when we share the stories of healthcare workers who toil away with patients sick, alone, and fighting to keep breathing, such as the one Reverend Janet Hunt tells of. She says, this nurse, like countless ones around the world, had a 33-year-old in her care when he suddenly spiked a fever of 104. Alone in the room with him, she immediately began to pack him in ice to bring his fever down. Only there was not that much ice in the room, so she called out for more. And while she waited, she started soaking paper towels in water and using those instead. And she shouted to him as she worked, all you have to do is keep breathing. I'll do the rest. She is pointing to God because she is not caring about herself and staying to hold him so that she can do the rest. We are pointing to Christ when we put our mask on, even in our own discomfort, in the hopes that we can protect our neighbor. We are pointing to Christ rather than to ourselves when we gather around screens to worship, instead of insisting on our right to gather the way we've always known. We are giving witness to the self-sacrificing Christ when we study together via Zoom in order to limit the spread. We are pointing to Christ when we care for one another by staying at home and finding other ways to connect to each other that doesn't involve in-person gatherings. Today is Gaudete Sunday, which is another way of saying joy. I sometimes say it as a fancy way of saying joy. And I can't help but think that as hard as it is to give up our own comforts and think on our own desires and our own wants and wishes, when we worry less about ourselves and point to the love of God in the world, we will find joy. Because when we point to God, we point to hope.